Any questions, any comments?
Thank you very much. This is a general question about the Trade for All agenda. So you've highlighted the breakdown in political consensus that's come from, in recent times, which I think would be fair to say is probably originates in a breakdown in the public trust in the process, which is reflected in the political arena. So, two questions. One is, in the course of this, how do you see the openness? I don't mean in the sense of access of goods and services. I mean openness in terms of the information flow and input into trade negotiations in the wider group, the wider civil society, and how do you see that changing in a Trade for All agenda? And the second, which is a related part of it, is if we come up with a satisfactory, answer to that question here, to what extent is that going to be able to be implemented globally? Because in a sense, we need to be, we may be leading or maybe not, but we need to be in an environment where a more open access to information is allowable, because obviously it was closed off, through various confidentiality agreements and failure to release data. So to what extent is there parallel change happening that would make it possible for us to implement a more open consultation process?
We really want to hear people's ideas about how they would like to be consulted in general about our trade policy, but also during our trade negotiations. There are a lot of examples we can draw on internationally. Different countries do things in different ways. We hope that the Trade for All Advisory Board will look at this issue and make recommendations about it. Whether there is something that New Zealand can do better, drawing on other examples of what other countries do. I mean, for example, the United States creates cleared advisors, I think, who review text. Mexico has a system of what they call the room next door, that is advisors that go with them to trade negotiations. They tend to be all business people, but I mean, that's a model. The European Union has a lot of interesting structures and processes around delivering as much information as it can and allowing comment in the process of trade negotiation when it makes major shifts in its trade policy, which Martin might want to comment on. But I mean, certainly the European Trade for All agenda is worth looking at in that regard for some thinking there. So we want to hear these ideas, and they do range from small tweaks to quite substantial revisions. And I'd say at the moment we're open to all such ideas. In terms of implementing them, or building a coalition for that kind of approach more broadly, the way we would do that is we would start with our partners with which we have trade agreements and in the WTO. I think if we were successful, it would speak for itself to a significant extent. If public trust in the negotiating process becomes stronger and stronger because people feel they have an appropriate and adequate chance to be consulted for their needs, I think you would see strengthened public confidence, and that would be an outcome in its own right that we could promote with our trade partners.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. You're right that the EU has some certain practices that we've had quite a good look at because they're useful. They are specific to their context where they have a different institutional structure. But what we've tried to do in starting the EU negotiation is to try to provide as much information as we can at the start of the negotiations, and we will seek to do that throughout the negotiations. We're not going to do it exactly the same way as the EU. They have perhaps the luxury of being a little more transparent with their texts than we are, and I think we don't really want to conduct a text negotiation in public, but what we want to be able to do is to explain as best we can at each stage of the negotiations where we're at, what the issues are that are on the table, and to invite people to engage with us. so that we can hear views very clearly and we can explain where we think the EU is coming from and how we, in general terms, are going to address that. But these are quite delicate negotiations, and we feel that our national interest is not served by a specific open negotiation on specific text. Even the EU doesn't do that. They make a range of texts available right at the beginning, the opening text, and then they make available what's completed at the end. And like us, they have a process of consultation with the public, with stakeholder groups during the course of the negotiations. So we want to make sure we do it as much as we can, as much as negotiations allow, and to give you, as we are today, the opportunity to talk to us. And we'll also meet singly, in groups as well, we're able to have perhaps a slightly more open conversation in a closed setting. And we're very willing to do that.
Vangelis, I think you've something to add.
as always. Look, you're absolutely right. I mean, the first thing I'd say is we know as negotiators that it just can't be business as usual, that something has to change, that clearly this wasn't working the way things were being done. So that's the first thing I think we really need to be clear about. And certainly me, who's ultimately responsible to the government on this, I'm very clear in my own mind, and ministers have been very clear on that. So how do we make that change? So I think you started to see our attempts at this in the CPTPP. So I was the chief negotiator for the CPTPP. And what we tried to do there was tried to start opening up a bit of that. So for example, you saw us release the text before the agreement was signed. We did that in TPP as well. But that is not our traditional practice. So I was the chief negotiator for the ASEAN Australia New Zealand FTA and the Malaysian New Zealand FTA. We did not release the text until the agreement was signed. That was the traditional way we did it. That's one of the changes we've made. We also released the national interest analysis before the agreement was signed. Again, that's a different thing than what we used to do. In CPTPP, already the previous government was already moving in that direction. There was a much clearer direction to us to get out there, start talking to people, seek views, be more open, be more transparent. That was clear even under the previous government, and the current government has continued that. And to give you a couple of practical examples, between the election of the new government and the conclusion of the substantial elements of the CPTPP, before we went to signature, we had 19 public meetings in that period of time. And then we had a further 11 information sessions after the signature of the agreement, trying to kind of explain ourselves, how we got to this, and trying to be as honest as we can about the balance that, as negotiators, we look to strike in these agreements between both the risks and the opportunities that are there for New Zealanders. Look, the second thing that I'd say is international practice varies, right? So Martin and Claire have both identified countries that are quite open and are willing to do that, but that is not the case for all of our partners. So one of the challenges we have is that we may be wanting to become more open, but that is not the case with all of our partners, particularly in this particular part of the world as well. So there are some challenges there, but we clearly have some partners. So again, Canada, Chile and New Zealand issued a joint declaration when we signed CPTPP, signalling a clear change of direction. And it's worth a read. It's the joint statement on progressive and inclusive trade, where we talked about exactly your concern, the transparency, that this has to change, that we do need to kind of get it as negotiators. So my final comment is a really brief one. Look, we understand we need to do better. We understand the risk that we ran and became material in Parliament when the breakdown of consensus that has operated through all of our trade agreements until very recently. So we understood how serious that is and what a challenge that then presents for small country negotiators working in the world if you don't have a social kind of license, a contract at home. So we know and understand that. And fundamentally, we absolutely understand it can't be business as usual. We have to change. And this, I hope, is what you will see as we look to do this, what Claire is leading, and then what Martin is leading, very directly, the kinds of engagement that we're looking to do in substance. And the final comment I'd make is we're really trying hard in our internet material, sort of our web-based material, to make it plain language. And I'll be honest with you, that's a real challenge for us to kind of translate ourselves into something that kind of means something to people when they read it. But you know what? We'd love to have your feedback on it. So we really tried in CPTVP to explain these arcane concepts that were there in a plain language term. I'd welcome people going back and saying, you know what? I didn't understand that. What on earth do you mean by X? We'd love to hear from you on that because we are committed to make sure that our material is much more accessible than we have before. We've assumed things that are clearly not right. So if I can leave that one thought, we get it. We know that this has to be done. Now our challenge is actually to implement that and really do this properly in a way that satisfies people like you and others around the country.
Thanks very much. Now we have a question over here.
Faye Sumner. And I'd just like to thank you. I think this is an excellent forum and for just these sort of discussions, but I just wish there were a lot more people here. A quick question for Martin, and then I'm just going to make a general comment as well. Your figure of 22 billion in trade, did that include the UK? Because at the moment they're in. So it's going to be very interesting after March what that figure actually ends up as without the UK in there, because it will be.
It takes out about a quarter of our imports with the European Union, and about a third of our exports, or slightly less than a third of our exports. Once the UK leaves.
Because we certainly say, well, what's in it for Europe to trade with New Zealand, in size-wise, but of course there's always opportunities. But I'm just going to make a general comment about the free trade agreements. One of the areas I think you could certainly think about reaching out more. In our manufacturing export sector, we've got 20, 30 small businesses manufacturing, exporting, and some are slightly more medium, but they are very much small to medium-sized businesses. And when I talk to them, they don't really know what a free trade agreement can do for them. And I agree with Anjali that saying that your language needs to be more simplified. I even try and explain the GPA to them. And I just think that they think those free trade agreements are up here somewhere, but where the rubber hits the road, they don't understand how to use them to their advantages in their markets. But I know that the MFAT are working close with NZTE in market, and I think there needs to be more of that support, and it's good to be actually located together or working together for market access. It's not about it, because it's not so much about the tariffs, it's actually what you do in the market. And so my suggestion is to think more about getting to the grassroots, your messages of how trade can be for all, and supporting these companies in market, because at the moment they just think it's something the government's doing way up here somewhere and don't really understand the implications.
Thank you very much for that comment. I think a lot of nodding heads. I don't know if you want to say anything to that. Now I have Barry, I have this gentleman behind you, Barry, and a couple of people down the back. So why don't you just pass it to the person next to you, and then we'll go to Barry and then down to Rachel and Niels.
Yes, thank you. Mine is pretty much, and I wanted to follow on from the lady who was just talking, because my experience of the free trade agreements is that we have some pretty lofty goals and some very, very well negotiated trade agreements with our trading partners. But what we experience, I'm a freight forwarder and a customs broker. So talking about trade coming in, there's some definite conflicts between what the MFAT's understanding of the free trade agreements has negotiated mean, but definitely some of the domestic regulatory people are not out of step with MFAT and don't seem to be towing the same or speaking from the same page. So I guess my question is there more work that can be done to make sure that the domestic regulatory agencies are in fact paying attention to the free trade agreements, understanding what they actually mean, and coming out with rulings and decisions that are actually binding rulings and decisions that are actually in line with what the free trade policies are, because at the moment there's a couple there that are extremely embarrassing, I guess, for the government if some of the stuff was made public. And, at the moment there's some government regulatory authorities that are at direct conflict with MFAT's views. So, I think that some of that work between government organisations would be really valuable, and also, as the lady was just saying, getting out there amongst importers and exporters and actually explaining to people what the free trade agreements mean, and explaining to people how they can most benefit from them, because at the end of the day, that is the reason and the purpose and the public good of free trade agreements. And it's all right having nice agreements with the EU, but like I think you said, there was perhaps a 70% fall off of stuff that is lost sometimes if the free trade agreements aren't implemented well.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to quickly comment on that. Noted. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just make a couple of quick points. So, I mean, we are definitely interested in hearing about sort of domestic rigidities. So really keen to hear, particularly if those are at odds with not least our legal obligations, but also if there's a kind of a constraint there that's there. I don't think we would be alone as an agency in wanting to hear about that, working with NZTE, MB and our colleagues around town. We'd certainly be interested in hearing that. I wanted to make a quick advertisement for some of the tools that are there, and they're not MFAT tools, they're actually tools that we've developed together with our government agency colleagues. There's the tariff finder. So as a small company, you can go in, look on that website, type in your product, and you can find out exactly what the tariff is that applies to your product. The preference that we negotiated for you in CPTPP, in the ASEAN agreement.
It's coming up on the...
Great. So this is a very helpful, transparent kind of tool that's designed to very simply help firms, in particular, to do the kind of things you said. But one of the things you said is reminded me that one of the things we're working on and hope to roll out later on this year or early next year is the same kind of information, but about services. So we know that there are a lot of New Zealand firms that are exporting services that don't think that the free trade agreements deliver them anything. But actually, the free trade agreements can deliver them an enormous amount. It's just information. And so what we're trying to do, and this will be a world first, no other country does this, would be to provide a services finder kind of instrument whereby you could type in the service, say you're an environmental services consultant or a consultant on legal services, you'll be able to type that in, and then we will be able to tell you what we negotiated, what preference we negotiated for you as a New Zealand company operating in Indonesia or operating in Malaysia or in Vietnam. And you'd be surprised, there are some very specific things that we negotiated for companies. Engineering firms, for example, in Indonesia, have lower requirements than their competitors from Chile or the European Union, for example. So there are a whole set of things that we can do. They have faster licensing approval. If you are a New Zealand firm operating in Malaysia, you can get your license approved more quickly than your Chilean competitor. So practical things, but we need to get that information out there exactly as both of you have said, and this is designed to that. The third tool that we have where we really do want to hear from you is the non-tariff barrier portal, this one. We have a commitment as New Zealand agencies to reply to you within 48 hours. So within 2 working days, we will reply to you. Please tell us what your problem is internationally, and we will tell you, A, that we agree with you, yes, this is a barrier, and we're now going to work together on a strategy for breaking that down. Or we will be very honest with you and say, look, sorry, that's a perfectly legitimate right to regulate kind of barrier, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, a protection for the environment or something, that's perfectly legitimate. We'll be very honest with and direct with you to help you understand that this isn't actually a barrier, that it's one of the costs of doing business. So we're looking to try to be helpful to firms in very practical ways. If we identify a non-tariff barrier, we'll work together with you and our colleagues from NZTE, Ministry for Primary Industries, MB, whoever that needs to be involved to structure a strategy around this. The strategy will range from a whole range of possibilities, working with other countries who may have a similar problem, so the Canadians or the Chileans or the Singaporeans may have exactly the same problem as us. We'll be working in a structured and deliberate way with them to try to break down that barrier for you. We have opportunities to raise it through our free trade agreements. In other words, through a legal instrument, we can try to pursue that non-tariff barrier for you. We can raise it in the regular committees of the World Trade Organization, where often you find that people are embarrassed if you raise the existence of this non-tariff barrier, and you find that in this gentle way of raising the profile of the issue in a public way, you put pressure on that country to try to make that reform. So please, test us. Send us your problem, and we'll respond to you in 2 working days. That's my personal commitment to you all. We do take this really seriously. Actually, all of the interesting rules of the negotiations we do are like nothing compared to actually dealing with an exporter's actual practical day-to-day problem, and we really can help you.
Right, thank you very much. Now I'm just going to take the next 3 speakers in turn and then ask you for some comments, and then I've got a couple more speakers at the back there as well. So we'll just start with Barry, and then we'll pass it to Rachel, to Niels, and then to the gentleman in the... Oh, you got to go? Do you mind if he goes? Yeah. Thanks very much, Barry.
We own a small to medium-sized business, and I just made a couple of notes. I was surprised to see it at the bottom of your list, and you both referred to it as your last item. Behind woman, behind Mary, I would like to have seen it a little bit further up your list and a little bit more priority. So that was my question is, when you create your forum or your group or your committee or whatever it is, what percentage are you going to look at bringing in of small to medium-sized business? So there's already been in the media already about this. And how much emphasis is going to be put on meat and dairy? Because we've seen so many trade talks being held back for the medium and small businesses of New Zealand because meat and dairy is so important to basically, and if we back Fonterra, that's doing well for you at the moment, isn't it? So my question is, what percentages of small to medium-sized business type of people are you going to look at bringing onto your group?
I'll throw that to you right now before we go to the other 3 comments and questions, please.
We're not actually bringing anyone onto the board. The board is being created by its chair. We're not saying how many people should be on it or who should be on it. We have employed the chair, or the minister has appointed the chair to find a representative selection of New Zealanders. So it's nothing to do with MFAT other than that we've created the space for it. We think he understands very, very clearly who needs to be on the board, or who needs to be represented on the board. If you want us to pass his details, your details onto him, happy to do that, and he can get in contact with you directly, which he's been doing with respect to everybody else who's raised that question with him. So yeah, just to make the point that we've created the board chair, we've given him the flexibility to put that group together. We're really confident he's going to come up with a good selection of people. There's not a particular
Hierarchy.
There's no particular hierarchy in that list. So SMEs are a very important part of our economy. They're as important as any other item on that list of 5.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much for coming along today. That's one of our big challenges, that SMEs simply don't have the time. They're flat out busy, trying to meet payroll, trying to make sure that the 3, 4, 7 staff members have got work coming in, and they often tell us, we just can't come. So I really am grateful that you've come and that you've raised that. Look, we take SMEs extremely seriously indeed. It's one of the big challenges that we face. If you look at the data, we know that 70% of our SMEs are exporters. More than 95% of them are exporting to one market. It tends to be Australia. Then there's a sharp drop-off into markets like the United Kingdom, the EU more generally, the United States. There's a very sharp drop-off, and they're not taking the opportunities that we think we negotiated for them, but clearly there's some disconnect going on. We're looking to try to find out what that is. What we would really be grateful for is to hear specifically from you, what are your non-tariff barriers? Tell us through this, tell us through the portal, we'll give you an answer within 2 days, or put a submission into Trade for All and let us know. I mean, your concerns, I think, are mirrored by a lot of small and medium enterprises. I heard a lot of them at the Foreign Affairs and Defence Select Committee as well, through their peak body, saying, we haven't heard enough about how these agreements work, we're not sure that they really are for us, are they really just for the meat and dairy industries? They are absolutely not. But the challenge we have is trade for all, right? It's supposed to be for all, and SMEs are a really important part of that. So we're absolutely committed to trying to do something. What we're grappling with is, what's the best way to do that? Claire has quite properly pointed out that the Trade Advisory Board is independent. and it's strictly independent from us. So we are not able, as officials, to meddle in the way that's structured. But I think I can be confident saying that David Pine, who's heading that, knows very well indeed, coming from the small and medium enterprise sector himself, in the firm that he was running, about the challenges that those firms face. But if I have any message at all, is tell us, send us a submission, drop us an email. We do want to know, and we do want to get this right. It's why the government has listed you amongst that top 5 cluster, and they're not ranked in order, as there's no hierarchy to that set, but they're really important reference points for us.
Well, thank you for raising that very important point, and there's someone there to collect your details if you'd like to share them. Now I'd like to ask Barry and then Rachel and Niels to make comments, and we'll take you as a threesome.
Hi, Barry Coates again. I just wanted to pick up on the question around transparency, and I think it is one very important way to rebuild public trust in trade negotiations. And I think often people look at the fact that when we negotiate United Nations agreements, for example, you can see the text of what's being negotiated after each round of negotiations. Similarly, in the WTO, there's a greater transparency in being able to share texts on ongoing negotiations. But when it comes to free trade agreements, then somehow these supposedly can't be negotiated in public. And it's kind of like if we were having domestic regulation in New Zealand, if we're having law change, not being able to see what a select committee has produced before the government agrees the final version of it. So I think for many people it goes beyond the kind of what might be seen as an inappropriate level of detail to actually a principle of accountability. That actually, in many areas of public life, we're moving away from, we're not going to show you what this says, but we're going to tell you about it and we're going to consult you based on our interpretation and the way that we talk about the agreement. And I think people think that's not acceptable anymore. And so I would encourage you to think more broadly about it, and particularly with the European Union. It would be good if New Zealand at least matched the EU's practice of disclosing their proposals into the negotiation. Because the EU says that's a fundamental accountability for us. What are we proposing into the negotiation? We can be held to account for that. And I think it's a shame that New Zealand hasn't gone that far. So that's my question. Is there any scope for us perhaps being able to consider that?
Thanks, Barry. And I'll pass it down to Rachel and followed by Niels before we go back to the panel. Oh, and there's one more person down there too. Rachel's it here? It's okay. Oh, our friend's coming back again with a...
So my question relates to protecting, which is a theme that's in your marketing, protecting the public interest. It's as we know, very dynamic and sort of fast-paced global environment at the moment with protectionism and nationalism, and creating new country alliances with the EU, US, France, other countries joining in on that. In what capacity will China's One Belt and One Road infrastructure initiative feature in relation to the rules-based system, and what planning is being established in regards to emerging alliances, many on New Zealand's back door, South Asia, Southeast Asia, North Africa, Eastern Europe, many of these anti-authoritarian countries, to protect and mitigate New Zealand trade from dynamic power shifts, competition and national security or opportunities in the other respect.
Thank you. Now, if we could just hear from Rachel, who's been waiting patiently, and Niels before we go back to the panel. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Rachel from Oxfam. A very quick question just on the panel's view about the role of social impact analysis in respect to free trade agreements. And the second question actually rolls into just what people have been raising, but it goes back to that one on the post-Brexit environment. And particularly, what are we doing right now in respect to aligning ourselves to be in a position of entering into trade agreements with post-Brexit, which does really pie into that earlier question have you got a strategy for the next couple of years as you're looking at all those other range of free trade agreements?
Niels.
Thank you. Thanks all for your presentations. Vangelis, you spoke of risks to the WTO system. Do our bilateral free trade agreements stand up independently of the WTO system, or are they reliant on it?
Right, so those were the full questions. I've got a note of them if you don't, but if you'd like to, I'd just like to throw it open now to the panel to respond.
Just this question of transparency. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question to put, and Barry, I mean, you make some comparisons with other negotiations, which I'm not too familiar with. I mean, this was something we certainly considered, and we certainly put the option in front of ministers when we looked to propose to them what we would do for the transparency of the negotiations. So at this point, they haven't decided that that would be in our negotiating interests. You know, taking into account that New Zealand is in a situation in a bilateral context very often where we're a small country dealing with a much more powerful partner, and we have very little negotiating leverage, and we seek to protect that leverage as much as possible, what we have. So I think this is something we'll probably continue to hear throughout the Trade for All consultations, and it's something that we would probably have to put back to ministers to see. But our undertaking, as I said before, is that during the EU FTA process, we will try to put out as much information as we can, and we are certainly open to discuss the situation with anybody out there who wants to come and talk to us. So that, I mean, that is a very firm undertaking that we will make.
And on the other points?
Yeah. Maybe I could just add one comment to Martin's point, which is to just bear in mind two things. One is we do want to share information, but there are some bits of information that we will not share. So we are not going to disclose publicly the bottom line of New Zealand negotiating positions on specific issues. So there is going to be a limit to what we are prepared to share. And the second thing to bear in mind is there's a real asymmetry in these negotiations. New Zealand is a small country. The EU, for example, or some of our partners in the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, whether they're China or India or Japan, are enormous countries. And so there's an asymmetry there where we feel we do need to protect some of our bottom lines and are less able to be transparent in the way the EU does, because the EU and the United States, which ironically do run relatively transparent processes, have a distinct reason why they want to reveal what their bottom line is to try to nail you into a corner. That is not in our ability. And so one of the challenges we'll face in the consultations is the extent to which we can talk about what our real bottom line might be on particular, whether it's a tariff question or indeed a rules-related question. So there are some really fine balances and judgments that need to be made by negotiators in their public consultations. And I don't think New Zealanders, I do think New Zealanders do understand the need to protect that national interest point there. Just on, the interesting question or series of questions around protecting the public interest sort of in that geopolitical sphere, maybe to make a couple of observations about that. So this is something that I really worry about. It's in a world where the rules are starting to fracture, and you do see the emergence of these two major powers, an established power, the United States, and a rising power re-emerging, however you want to describe them, whether it's China, whether it's India, the balance that the EU might be able to play, all of those things, they're a concern to me, because I think about how does New Zealand fit in? Where do we fit in? And how do we make decisions about the priorities we place on the various relationships that we're trying to develop, whether those are trade or political and so on. And the real challenge for us, I would argue, is not that we operate as an atom out there on our own, but that we construct and engage in the architecture that's created around the region. That is the way we mitigate and protect ourselves from situations where the big can impose their will on the rest of us. So I get very, very nervous indeed when I hear about the EU, Japan and the United States meeting together to talk about what they might be able to do, the three of them, on autos or on rules around the car industry. Because I conclude from that, there's nothing good that comes out of it when the big countries get together and 3 or 4 of them get together and leave the rest of us out, which is why it's so important for New Zealand to be active in all of these other fora. That's why I talked about APEC. That is so crucial for us to be one of that group of countries that can help influence and shape outcomes internationally. So for me, one of the big objectives of New Zealand trade policy is to be in that room, to be part of that architecture. That strategy I laid out is all about embedding our economy into the region, into the architecture, and it's about protecting our national interests. And you can't do that if you're outside of the system, because then small countries are really stuck. So what you'll see from us, and you asked very specifically, what are we doing in the future? You'll see us very actively looking to build coalitions with other, often smaller and medium-sized countries with which we share similar perspectives and values. We're not naive. We know that all of us little e's together, more than the overwhelming majority of the WTO membership, by the way, are small countries, but we know we need big countries to buy into this. And so part of our work is going to be going to Washington, going to Beijing, going to Delhi, going to Brussels and reminding them, listen, this system that we've had since 1995 is really important to us as a group of small countries, not just little old New Zealand. So it's active building of those coalitions. That's the way we protect our interests. And that's the way I think of One Belt, One Road, is how does it fit into the rules-based system and how does it support and sustain that? And that, for me, is where I come out. So when I often get asked in these public sessions, whose side are you on, China's or the United States? I always say the same answer. I'm on the side of the rules. Small countries have to rely on those rules. That's what protects us. If these rules crumble, we have got a really serious problem. There was a really good question from you on social impact analysis. And I know that that's going to be a feature of the discussion, at least that's what David Pine has told us around, you know, how do you assess these agreements? I would make the point that we do have in our national interest analysis an element that says what is the social impact of the agreement. And I think there's an interesting question around what more or how we might need to be looking at those things. I might give back to Martin on the Brexit question, and finally, but on the really interesting question on the WTO and the interrelationship between the FTAs and WTO. Look, the FTAs are clearly inspired by the WTO, so you see many of the WTO agreements replicated and expanded in the free trade agreement. So sanitary and phytosanitary chapter text in the FTA is always derived from the WTO agreement and then built on. The challenge we face is to make sure that those free trade agreements are genuinely open, like to other countries to join, that they're building blocks. So trade economists talk about building blocks versus stumbling blocks. So building blocks to the system are ones that are genuinely supportive, that push out the rules a bit further, that are open to other members. The stumbling blocks are the ones that do less than WTO level commitments, that are closed agreements, that are not open to all. And that, again, is the real fear I have about some of what I hear, what the big countries are doing, whether it's China, India, United States, EU. When you see the big countries getting together, you know that's bad news for the small countries. And that's a good working principle for all New Zealand trade policy practitioners, in my view. Martin, do you want to say something on
last
Brexit?
word on Brexit. We're just about running out of time.
Okay, so just very briefly, and a very good question too, because you know, from my perspective as the EU FTA chief negotiator, what happens in Brexit does have, could have quite a significant impact on the prospects for an EU FTA. We want that sorted out. The more certainty there is about the future trading relationship and of course the broader relationship between the EU and the UK, the better it is for us to be able to conclude an agreement agreement. But just very briefly what we're doing on that score. First of all, there are the current commitments of the European Union towards us, which obviously encompass at the moment the commitments of the UK. And we want to ensure that when that exit takes place, that the UK and the EU honour their commitments to us, their current commitments in the WTO. So that's a really high priority for us. The secondly is that there are a range of other agreements that we also have with the European Union, and we want to see continuity once the UK leaves the EU. Good example is the veterinary agreement that covers a lot of our major trading items with the European Union. We'd like to see that replicated in a similar form with the United Kingdom so that our trade with the UK can continue on the same basis. And thirdly, positioning ourselves for a future FTA with the United Kingdom. We think we're quite well positioned now to be one of the first countries to launch negotiations with the United Kingdom just as soon as they're in a position to do so.
Thank you very much, Martin. And unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, but I do want to stress the point that Claire made is that this is the beginning of a conversation. There will be other opportunities for you to have your say, and I'd strongly encourage you to do so. I'd like to thank you very much, the audience, for your very thought-provoking questions and comments. I think we've got a lot of material from this session, and I'd also like to thank very warmly our speakers. Could you join with me to thank Vangelis and Claire and Martin? Thank you very much.